They wore the king's colors, carried his banners, and marched under his command. But that didn't mean they were truly his. In the brutal, unforgiving world of the medieval era, kings ruled with crowns on their heads and swords at their sides, but they were never as safe as they looked. Behind every throne stood men trained to kill, soldiers, guards, commanders, who swore loyalty with their mouths but held the king's life in their hands. The deeper you look into medieval history, the clearer it becomes. The greatest threat to a king's life didn't always ride in from enemy lands. Sometimes it stood right behind him, watching silently, waiting. This isn't just about warfare. It's about power, control, betrayal, and why even the most powerful rulers lived in fear of the very men sworn to protect them. Number 1, power in the hands of killers. In the harsh and chaotic world of medieval Europe, kings sat on thrones built on the illusion of divine authority. They claimed their right to rule came from heaven itself, and in formal ceremonies that belief was paraded before the nobles and the masses alike. But anyone who's looked past the polished surfaces of court life knows that thrones weren't secured by prayers or papal blessings. They were held by fear, steel, and blood. And the real enforcers of that power weren't bishops or scribes. They were the men who knew how to kill. The soldiers? Medieval soldiers weren't some nameless crowd dragged from farms to fill a formation. They were forged by years of violence, surviving bitter winters, disease-ridden camps, and sieges where rats were considered food, and loyalty meant nothing if your belly was empty. These men became monsters and martyrs in equal measure, depending on which side of the sword you stood. They didn't just carry weapons, they became them. Their bodies were walking tools of destruction, and their minds were molded by bloodshed more than any sense of law or order. And the most terrifying part? Many of them were smarter, more cunning, and far more decisive than the nobility who claimed to lead them. Kings relied on these men to win wars, crush rebellions, and defend borders. But once the fighting stopped, there was a problem. What do you do with killers who've tasted power? These weren't men you could just send home with a handshake and a few coins. War had made them something different. It had given them command over life and death, and in return, it had taken their fear of authority. Some of them went back to the villages they'd left behind and realized they didn't need to obey anymore. Others gathered their fellow veterans and carved out their own small dominions, ruling with the same ruthless force they had used in battle. And many of them stayed close to power, serving kings not out of loyalty, but because they understood how fragile a crown really was. What made this even more dangerous was how much the common people loved these men. In an age where most peasants never even saw their king, local warriors were heroes. They were the ones who defended villages from raids, who fought for bread and survival, not taxes and titles. They had scars, not robes. When they spoke, they didn't use riddles or rituals. They spoke like men, with brutal honesty. That connection gave them a kind of influence kings could never buy. A respected soldier's word could rally a village, ignite a riot, or push a small rebellion into full-scale war. And once that momentum started, no royal decree could stop it. Some of these soldiers rose to become warlords in their own right. They didn't need permission to rule, they took what they wanted with swords and strategy. In borderlands and lawless regions, these figures often replaced the authority of the crown altogether. They collected taxes, enforced their own justice, and made alliances based on strength, not bloodlines. And because they were seen as protectors rather than parasites, people followed them willingly. The king might have had a seal and a scroll, but a man with 20 loyal fighters and a good reputation had real power. Even within the courts of kings, these warriors couldn't be fully controlled. They sat at the king's table, but they weren't afraid to remind him how much he depended on them. Some became bodyguards, others took on roles as commanders or military advisors. But every king knew deep down that if these men ever turned against him, no wall would be thick enough, no guard loyal enough to keep the blade from his throat. And it wasn't always about ambition. Sometimes it was about betrayal. king who broke a promise to his soldiers, who failed to reward their service, or worse, punish them unjustly, was gambling with his own life. In a time when stories spread faster than truth, even the hint of discontent among elite warriors could set off panic. Kings had spies, sure, but they also had to sleep, and the knowledge that someone who once killed for you might now be thinking of killing you was the kind of fear that no ceremony or crown could wash away. That's why some rulers surrounded themselves with foreign guards or mercenaries. They thought outsiders would be less tempted by internal politics. But often, that just added another layer of unpredictability. Because if there's one rule medieval kings learned too late, it's this. Once you give a man the power to kill on your behalf, you'd better make sure he never starts thinking he could do the job better than you. Number 2, royal guards or silent threats. When people imagine a medieval king, they often picture a ruler flanked by loyal, armored warriors, men sworn to protect their liege until death. But the truth was more complicated. Those same guards, dressed in polished steel and standing within arm's reach of the throne, were both protectors and potential executioners. In fact, their closeness to power made them more dangerous than any distant enemy or rebellious noble. While the public saw them as symbols of royal strength, the kings themselves saw something else. A constant reminder of how thin the barrier was between security and assassination. Royal bodyguards weren't just decorative muscle stationed at the court for show. These were hand-picked, battle-tested men. Many had seen combat, survived ambushes, and personally killed enemies of the crown. They knew how to move silently, strike quickly, and disappear before blood dried on the floor. And they didn't just guard the king in battle, they guarded him while he slept, bathed, dined, and whispered with advisors. That level of proximity wasn't just intimate, it was deeply risky. Every day, these men watched the monarch's every movement, memorized his routines, overheard his secrets, and studied his weaknesses. And unlike the scheming nobles who plotted from afar, these guards were always within striking distance. In Byzantium, the Varangian Guard is one of the best-known examples of this double-edged sword. Composed largely of Norsemen and Anglo-Saxon exiles, they were deliberately chosen for their foreignness. The emperors believed that men with no ties to local politics were less likely to be seduced by internal rivalries. But that didn't make them loyal out of love. These were mercenaries, deadly professionals who followed gold, not bloodlines. As long as they were paid and respected, they served well. But any lapse in payment, any insult or broken promise, and their swords might find a new master. More than once, their loyalty proved conditional, and emperors who miscalculated paid the price not in reputation but in blood. Western Europe had its own versions. Many kings formed elite household troops, selecting men from noble families or battle-hardened veterans who had proven themselves in war. These guards were often granted special privileges, land or royal favor in exchange for their service. But those perks created a different problem: entitlement. The more rewards they received, the more they expected. Some grew arrogant, seeing themselves not just as servants, but as kingmakers, the true force behind the throne. And when that illusion broke, when a monarch tried to reassert control or deny a request, resentment brewed. What started as silent stares became cold disobedience. And from there, all it took was one ambitious whisper. The real issue wasn't just the possibility of betrayal. It was that betrayal could happen without warning, without public rebellion, and without a drawn-out siege. A guard didn't need to raise an army. He only needed a moment. During a feast, a private audience, or even while dressing the king for ceremony. One blade, one step forward, and everything could end in an instant. That's why many monarchs deliberately rotated their guard units, never allowing the same group to stay too close for too long. Loyalty, once rooted too deeply, could shift in dangerous directions. If a group of guards began to see themselves as a separate power within the court, untouchable, unified, and armed, it wasn't a matter of if they would act. It was when. To guard against this invisible threat, kings employed countermeasures. Some used spies among the guards, men tasked with reporting every conversation, every mood shift, every small sign of unrest. Others surrounded themselves with eunuchs or low-born men raised to power solely by royal favor, people who had no allies at court and whose survival depended entirely on obedience. In some cases, rulers placed more trust in foreign mercenaries than in their own subjects, believing outsiders could be bought more reliably than loyalty could be bred. Still, this solution created tension. Native nobles saw it as a betrayal, and the guards themselves knew they were not loved, only tolerated as long as they stayed useful. Yet, for all the fear they inspired, these guards were still essential. Without them, a king was exposed, and that contradiction haunted the minds of rulers across centuries. The men who formed a protective wall around the monarch were the same ones who could collapse it from within. Every day, kings placed their lives in the hands of men who had seen death up close and weren't afraid to use it. Trust was never pure. It was strategic, calculated, and laced with dread. So in medieval courts, appearances were always deceptive. A hall filled with armed guards wasn't a sign of strength. It was often a sign of fear. Every command given, every glance exchanged, was part of a silent game where survival depended not just on ruling wisely, but on sensing the moment a protector started thinking like a predator. Number 3, disbanded soldiers turned wolves. The battlefield may have gone quiet, but the threat never truly disappeared. When kings declared wars over, signed treaties, or claimed victory, the process of peace was never as clean as it sounded. There were no magic words to undo the armies they had created. Armies built on violence, hardened by loss, and trained to live by the sword. The truth is, disbanding thousands of soldiers didn't mean they disappeared into the soil. It meant they were released into a world that had no place for them. And for men who had spent years knowing only combat, the end of war was never a return to peace. It was a descent into something darker. These weren't naive farmhands or easily dismissed commoners. They were fighters who had survived mud, blood, starvation, disease, and fire. They had watched comrades die in ditches, held broken weapons with frozen fingers, and charged into the chaos of siege towers and cavalry clashes. War had been their purpose, and more importantly, their identity. When kings told them to go home, many had no home left. Villages had been burned, families were gone. The man who had once been a son, a father, a husband, was now just a soldier. And without war to fight, he needed something else to sharpen his blade on. The most dangerous of these ex-soldiers didn't turn to begging or simple crime. They turned to each other. They grouped together, bound by shared scars and mutual rage, forming what would become the nightmare of medieval Europe. Organized, roving bands of professional killers. These weren't chaotic mobs, they operated like companies. Structured, strategic, and deeply loyal to their commanders. Many of these bands evolved into fully fledged mercenary groups, offering their services to the highest bidder, be it a noble caught in a local feud, a foreign king, or even a bishop with enemies to burn. Their loyalty wasn't earned by bloodlines or honor, it was bought, and it came with a price. But when the coin dried up, so did the civility. Left without employment, these soldiers didn't simply drop their weapons. They turned them on the very world that had abandoned them. Villages were raided, travelers robbed, and entire regions extorted. They began seizing strongholds, small castles, abandoned forts, any structure with a wall and a gate, and used them as bases to launch raids or collect protection fees from terrified locals. Some even declared themselves lords, carving out autonomous zones ruled not by law but by iron. The countryside became fractured, dotted with fiefdoms that owed allegiance to no crown. What made them so dangerous wasn't just their ruthlessness, it was their independence. These men no longer needed a king to validate their power. They had the weapons, the manpower, the tactics, and the will. Many were led by seasoned captains who had once stood beside nobility on battlefields. These leaders knew the political landscape, understood military logistics, and could read the weaknesses of local lords better than any court advisor. Their operations were clean, often bloodless by necessity and always effective. Even when royal forces tried to intervene, they faced opponents who fought like armies, not bandits. In some regions, local peasants even preferred these soldier lords. Compared to corrupt tax collectors or absent noble families, a former commander who offered security in exchange for loyalty didn't seem like a terrible bargain. As long as the fields were untouched and the villagers protected from rival warbands, people tolerated, sometimes even supported these unofficial rulers. That kind of civilian backing made it even harder for monarchs to crush them. Because now it wasn't just an armed problem, it was a political one. Kings feared them deeply and with good reason. These groups had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Unlike traditional nobles, they weren't restricted by birth or court etiquette. They answered to no one, and their actions weren't slowed down by bureaucracy or debates. When they needed to move, they did. When they needed to strike, they didn't hesitate. They had the experience of war and the desperation of poverty. That mix created a kind of violence that was precise, effective, and unstoppable. And what made matters worse? Many of these disbanded soldiers felt betrayed. They had fought for the crown, spilled blood for someone else's ambition, and in the end, they were cast aside like used tools. That bitterness stayed with them. It shaped how they fought, how they ruled, and how they responded to royal authority. No amount of royal proclamations or knightly oaths could erase the fact that these men had once been the lions on the battlefield, only to be treated like rats in peacetime. So they adapted. They turned their backs on the throne and carved their own paths, reminding the world that you can't train men to kill, then expect them to forget. Number 4. Charismatic commanders and quiet uprisings. In the complex power games of the medieval world, kings were not the only men people followed. Every army marched under banners, but behind those banners were leaders, hardened veterans, not crowned monarchs, who earned their rank not through bloodline or inheritance, but through sheer force of will, instinct, and an ability to inspire. These were the commanders who had fought alongside their men, bled in the same mud, and survived sieges shoulder to shoulder with those they led. Unlike many nobles who barked orders from the rear, these figures stood at the front, and that made them dangerous. Because when a man leads from the front, he earns something far more powerful than command. He earns loyalty. Deep, unwavering loyalty that no throne could compete with. Charisma in the medieval army wasn't about fine speeches or rehearsed words. It was about presence. These leaders spoke with authority born of action. Their orders were obeyed not because they were feared, but because their men trusted them completely. A commander like that didn't need to raise a rebellion with swords. He could cause unrest simply by stepping into a room and standing still. His silence said more than a royal decree, and his glances could move hearts faster than sermons ever could. This was the kind of influence that kept kings awake at night, because influence like that, especially in the hands of a man with military experience, was a potential uprising waiting to happen. And these quiet uprisings didn't always begin with rebellion. In fact, many of them never even reached open warfare. They started subtly, with whispers in barracks, with nods during council meetings, with soldiers hesitating just slightly when asked to follow royal commands that didn't come from their favored general. It was in these tiny moments that kings began to feel their grip slipping. Because once the men started looking to someone else for guidance, the crown became a symbol, not a command. Take the commanders who rose from humble origins. These men didn't just understand military tactics, they understood the mindset of their troops. They knew what it meant to eat stale bread for weeks, to sleep in frozen armor, to bury a friend in silence under enemy fire. When they spoke of justice or vengeance or even hope, their words carried the weight of experience. Kings might speak from balconies, but these men spoke across campfires, and those conversations meant more. They built trust not through obligation, but through shared hardship. And once that kind of bond was formed, breaking it was nearly impossible. Kings recognized the danger even if they didn't always act in time. Some tried to reward these commanders with titles and land, hoping to turn them into nobles and dilute their influence. Others placed them under careful watch, surrounding them with flatterers and spies to isolate them from their troops. A few went further, reassigning them to distant garrisons, forcing retirements, or even arranging quiet assassinations to eliminate the threat before it fully emerged. But it wasn't always effective, because the men who had already captured hearts couldn't be erased so easily. Their absence only made their legend grow stronger, and stories spread faster in desperate times. Across Europe, the pattern repeated itself. Whenever a commander emerged who could unite the loyalty of his soldiers and speak the language of the people, the foundations of royal power trembled. It wasn't just about war, it was about influence. Authority that came from respect, not blood. That was always more lasting. Charismatic generals were dangerous precisely because they didn't need to claim the throne. They could control those who protected it. And that meant kings ruled only by their grace. The most clever monarchs kept their best commanders close but constantly undercut their popularity. They rotated units, broke up camps, and limited how long any one general could lead the same group of men. It was an exhausting game of containment, one that relied on paranoia and manipulation rather than trust. But the alternative, allowing one man to build too strong a following, was far more dangerous. Once soldiers began to chant the name of a general louder than that of their king, no crown could feel secure. Because in that moment, the army no longer belonged to the monarch. It belonged to the man they believed in. And belief in times of unrest was a more dangerous weapon than any blade. Number 5. The financial sword hanging over the crown. In the medieval world, the sword wasn't the only thing that kept kings in power. It was gold. Beneath all the banners, heraldry, and pomp, warfare bled kingdoms dry. Battles didn't just cost lives, they drained treasuries to the bone. From arming men to feeding them, from fortifying castles to transporting supplies across vast, unforgiving terrain, war was a financial monster that devoured silver faster than a king could mint it. And when the money ran out, what followed wasn't silence, it was rebellion. Medieval armies didn't run on loyalty alone. Yes, oaths were sworn and honor was talked about in public. But when it came down to day-to-day survival, soldiers didn't march for the glory of the realm. They marched for payment. Whether it was a knight expecting land or a foot soldier demanding his weekly coin, the expectation was clear. Service required reward. And once that expectation was broken, kings discovered just how quickly discipline unraveled. There was no time for diplomatic excuses when thousands of armed, battle-hardened men realized their stomachs were empty and their pockets even emptier. Troops without pay didn't wait politely. They acted. First came the grumbling, quiet and bitter. Then came the threats, subtle refusals to follow orders, sudden reluctance to engage the enemy, or loud protests in the king's own camp. But when weeks stretched into months and the gold still didn't arrive, patience snapped. Armed men with nothing to lose became the king's worst nightmare. They turned their swords inward, not against foreign invaders, but against the very hands that had once fed them. And no castle gate was strong enough to stop desperation mixed with fury. These weren't just random outbursts, they were calculated acts of mutiny. Whole regiments abandoned their posts, took control of supply caravans, or marched on royal treasuries demanding what was owed. The terrifying part for any ruler was the speed at which loyalty could shift when money disappeared. One day, a commander had control over his troops. The next, he was being dragged through the dirt by the very men who had once sworn to defend him. Didn't matter how grand the cause or how noble the bloodline. Without payment, kings found themselves outnumbered in their own camps. What made this even worse was how unpredictable these financial collapses could be. War was always more expensive than planned. Sometimes campaigns dragged on for years longer than expected. Other times, plagues or crop failures choked off tax revenue, leaving the royal coffers gasping for air. Kings had to borrow heavily, sometimes from foreign banks, sometimes from powerful nobles within their realm. And debt, like war, came with its own dangers. A king too deep in debt lost leverage, became dependent, and was eventually manipulated by those holding the purse strings. The very tools meant to fund the war became shackles around the throne. Even mercenaries who were supposed to be more reliable because they were paid professionals proved volatile when the gold dried up. Groups like the Landsknechts, infamous German mercenaries, were notorious for turning their rage inward when funds didn't arrive. These men didn't ask questions. They took what they were owed. Sometimes that meant looting entire towns. Other times it meant turning on their own employers. The irony was brutal. The very people hired to protect the kingdom became the ones who ravaged it when the money stopped flowing. Some kings tried to avoid this by promising land or titles instead of coin, but that strategy only worked when the land was valuable and uncontested. Once too many promises were made and not enough rewards could be delivered, tensions rose again. Soldiers began to see through the empty gestures. Words meant nothing to a man whose family was starving back home. What he wanted wasn't honor, it was silver in hand. So kings were caught in a trap. They needed large, well-trained armies to maintain control, suppress rivals, and expand their influence. But the larger the army, the more fragile their rule became. Every soldier added to the payroll was another potential rebel if the treasury failed. Every campaign promised victory but threatened financial ruin. Monarchs walked a razor's edge between strength and collapse, power and mutiny. And the cruelest truth? The moment a king began to fear his own army more than his enemies, the war had already shifted. No longer was the battlefield across a border or in a rival kingdom. It was within his own camp, inside the tent where hungry men sharpened blades and counted coins that never came.